What do these all have in common? You might not notice anything at first, but if you look closely, you'll notice that there's something weird going on with their front limbs. These limbs are called raptorial limbs, and they crop up everywhere in the insect world. Insects are the most diverse group of any other organism on the planet, with more species than anything else. With that much variation, you shouldn't be surprised to see convergent evolution happening. One of the traits that keep popping up over and over again is raptorial limbs. But what are raptorial limbs, and why are they so effective? Today we're going to answer those questions, and we're going to run through every group of insects that have raptorial limbs, or at least all the ones that I'm aware of. If I leave any out, leave a comment below. Before we really get started, we need to clarify a few things. First, what is convergent evolution? Convergent evolution is when two organisms that are not very closely related together converge on similar traits. A classic example that's slightly overused is the similarities between ichthyosaurs, dolphins, and sharks. All of these animals have streamlined bodies that help them swim more effectively, but they not only evolved at very different times in our Earth's history, but they also did not share a common ancestor. The other thing we should define is what a raptorial limb is. If you're not familiar, just think about a praying mantis, like this European mantis that you've probably seen in your very own backyard. Without looking at it under the scope, you can see the raptorial limbs. They're pretty obvious. A raptorial limb is where two opposing leg segments come together and form a pinching structure. In this case, it's the femur and the tibia coming together to form the pinching structure. Raptorial limbs are primarily used to grab and hold prey. In fact, raptorial or raptor comes from the Latin root to seize or to hold, which is the same place that birds of prey get their names from. Raptorial limbs are different from another pinching structure, the claw, like a scorpion's claw or a crab claw. The claw from scorpions or crabs are formed from the digits coming together to form a pinching structure instead of the leg. Technically, the claw is called a chela, and the raptorial limb is called a subchela, but we're going to stick with raptorial limb just to avoid confusion, and because I don't like saying subchela. There are two orientations that raptorial legs can be in. Vertical, like you see in mantids, or horizontal, like you see in Belostomatidae. Whether a raptorial limb is vertical or horizontal really depends on what they're being used for. If they're only being used to seize prey, they are more likely to be in the horizontal position. But if they're used for both seizing prey and walking, then they'll be in the vertical position. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's get looking at some bugs. I have here most of the main groups that have raptorial limbs. There are a few that I don't have, and for those you'll just have to enjoy some stock photos I found on the internet. And again, as we go through today, if you notice that I've left any raptorial limbs out, please comment below. So let's go back to that example that I gave earlier, the mantids. These are classic examples of multi-purposing their raptorial limbs for walking and hunting. Something that's really unique about mantids is that all the species within the order have raptorial limbs. In other orders, it's just a few species here and there or a few families, but in Mantodea, it's a defining trait for the order. So let's take a look at some of these adaptations that make a good raptorial limb. Obviously, there are the adaptations for the raptorial limb itself. The four tibia and femur have been beefed up, and there are some spines running down both sides. The coxa is elongated out, whereas in most insects, it's a relatively small segment. If you're not familiar with insect morphology, the coxa is similar to your shoulder, a ball and socket joint that rotates all around. This allows the insect to have a wide range of movement. If humans were to grow a raptorial limb, the shoulder would elongate out, and then your elbow would turn this way. So to do an accurate representation of a raptorial limb, you shouldn't do this.
Even Mantis has those thingies.
The first segment of the thorax is called the prothorax, and in mantids it's really elongated. And this makes sense. You don't want your raptorial legs getting all tangled up with your other legs, and you need a place to house all those large muscles used to power such large limbs. Notice that the mantids still retain many of their tarsal segments. We'll see variation in this in other insects depending on whether the raptorial limbs are used for walking or not. Alright, we're done with the mantids. Let's move on to the next group that have evolved raptorial limbs, the hemipterans or true bugs. The true bugs are weird. Not everyone in their group has raptorial limbs. Even within the same family, they don't all have raptorial limbs. But they have evolved raptorial limbs multiple times. The first group that we're going to look at, the assassin bugs, or Reduviidae, are a great example of this. Multiple species have convergently evolved raptorial limbs a couple of times throughout their history. I have here two different assassin bugs. The first is a thread-legged assassin bug. The other one is an ambush bug. Notice that both of these have reduced their tarsal segments into a single segment, and yet they still retain many of the same adaptations: an enlarged femur and tibia, elongated coccyx and prothoraxes. Okay, so Jeremy in post, I realized that I misspoke. I said that the ambush bug had elongated prothorax, but it really has a very compact prothorax, which you probably noticed right off the bat. Looking at this thread-legged assassin bug, you can actually see the character that defines the hemipterans or true bugs, which is a beak mouth part. The mouth part is fused into a long sucking structure, and so even these carnivorous ones are just sucking out the insides. The plant-eating ones will just suck out the insides of a plant, but in both cases, none of them have chewing mouth parts. Now let's look at another family, the damsel bugs, or Nabidae. They look very similar, but the tarsal segments are still present. Also, have you noticed the variation in the number of spines in the raptorial limbs? I'm not sure why they vary, but it is there. In fact, if you look at the next group, the water scorpions, or Nepidae, the spines are very short and frequent. It kind of reminds me of things that eat fish. Think of a gharial or a Spinosaurus, where they have small teeth all clustered together and very thin, short jaws. Really quick, to take a break from raptorial limbs, let's just look at water scorpions. They're really weird if you've never seen one before. Water scorpions get their name from this long tail at the end. This tail is not really a tail. It's actually a long tube that they use to breathe out of. Essentially, they've taken all their spiracles, the apparatus that insects use to breathe out of, and they've pushed it all the way to the back of their abdomen and extended that up so that they can stay underwater. It's a really neat adaptation, but if you didn't know, you would think that it might be a big stinger or something, hence the name. Water scorpions have really weird raptorial limbs. They're very thin instead of thick and beefy. Instead of the tibia being elongated, it's actually reduced by quite a bit. That's because they're grabbing small little aquatic prey. And again, we're seeing a reduction in the tarsal segments in the water scorpions. This makes sense. If you're swimming, you don't need to walk. Now, this water scorpion that I have has vertical limbs. However, there are some that have a horizontal positioning. But they look very similar to Belostomatidae or Naucoridae, both of which have the horizontal position. Let's take a look. Notice that in the horizontal position, you do not need as long of a prothorax or as long of a coccyx. Also, to me, the raptorial limb seems a little more beefy, but I don't know if that has anything to do with the positioning or if it's just the raptorial limbs. Of course, in the water, you don't need to walk around, so it's not surprising that the aquatic groups are the ones that usually evolve the horizontal positioning. Alright, we're finished with the hemipterans, or true bugs. Now we're going to move on to one of my favorite groups, the mantisflies. Mantisflies clearly demonstrate the power of convergent evolution. Many people misidentify mantisflies as mantids. But mantisflies actually belong to a group called Neuroptera, or the lacewings. Maybe you're familiar with lacewings, or antlions, or owlflies. All of these are neuropterans. Neuropterans can be easily recognized by their body shape and wing venation. But take a look at this mantisfly. It really does look like a praying mantis. Some of the differences between these and other mantids, though, are that these guys are more aerial than mantids. I've seen them hunt on the wing, which is pretty cool. Mantids usually will like to sit and wait, whereas these guys will kind of track down their prey. Another difference between them and mantids is that they're primarily nocturnal. They're filling the same niche as mantids are, except they're doing it at night. To add to the coolness of this group, the ones that come out during the day not only have converged with mantids, but they've also converged with wasps, disguising themselves as something that would hurt predators to avoid predation. How cool is that? Obviously, being so close to appearance to mantids, they have a lot of the similar traits. Elongated prothorax, elongated coccyx, and the femur and tibia beefed up. But notice that they have a reduction in the tarsal segments. This is because they hunt primarily on the wing. Now we're coming to the end of the insect family tree and going into the Diptera, or the true flies. There are only 2 genera that I know of in Diptera that have raptorial limbs. This is the Ochthera and the Chelipoda. Do you notice something that's missing from the group of traits we've been talking about? Yeah, they don't have elongated prothoraxes. Why is that? Well, this is because evolution has to work with what it already has. Diptera have short prothoraxes. In fact, they don't have any at all. Maybe you know this, but flies are really good at flying. And part of the reason they're so good at this is because they've reduced the segments in their thorax to house more muscle. And if you don't have a prothorax to begin with, evolution can't just give you another one without re-evolving it. It's easier just to work with what you have than to re-evolve the prothorax to have raptorial limbs, so they just did what they needed to. You might have noticed that they also have a lot of tarsal segments for something that's doing a lot of flying. Without a long prothorax to get them off the ground, they'll be on the ground, and so you need tarsal segments. Now, we pretty much went through the family tree, except that I did skip one group, the Hymenopterans, or the wasps and bees and ants. And I skipped them because I'm pretty sure most entomologists would argue with me that these aren't true raptorial limbs because we have to divide everything, but they function pretty much in the same way. So let's take a look at them. These insects probably have the coolest raptorial limbs ever. They're the Chalcididae wasps, and hopefully you see right off the bat what's so different about them. Their raptorial limbs are backwards. It's their hind limbs, or metalegs, not the prolegs, that are raptorial. Now, this family was recently found to be paraphyletic, so it might not stay together for much longer, but you have to admit they are some awesome looking insects. Now, if the point of a raptorial limb is to catch and seize prey, why would these little wasps have the raptorial limbs as far away from their mouth as possible? Well, if you know anything about wasps, especially little teeny ones like this, you've probably already guessed that they're parasitic. Most wasps are parasitoids. Parasitoids are different from parasites in that the host will die after serving its purpose, whereas with parasites the host doesn't normally die. But like any good parasite, they have to get inside their host. And the mother Chalcid wasp uses those raptorial limbs in quite a brutal way. They will seize the host with their raptorial limbs, and then using their ovipositor, a needle-like structure that lays eggs, they will insert it into the host and lay the egg inside the host. Not a great day to be their host. In fact, there's one species, maybe even others, that parasitize antlions, a group within the Neuropterans that we've already talked about. The females use their raptorial limbs to pry open the antlion's jaws and insert an egg down the throat of the antlion. How amazing is that? And maybe a little disturbing. And that brings us to the end of all the groups that I know of that have raptorial limbs. Again, if I've left any out, please let me know. I've also made a list of all the honorable mentions that are kind of raptorial limbs or things that are not insects that have raptorial limbs, and I put them on the website, just to make a good comprehensive list of everything that has raptorial limbs. And now we need to answer this question. Why do so many unrelated groups of insects want or need raptorial limbs? Obviously they're good for seizing prey, but what about them exactly makes them good for seizing prey? Let's talk about that. If we look at the outside, we can state some obvious things. A feature that allows you to grab and immobilize prey is pretty nice. And the teeth on the raptorial limbs make it so the prey can't escape. However, claws do the same thing, and they seem a little less expensive when you think about just modifying your tarsal segments versus the leg segments. And in fact, we do see a lot of claws popping up all over the place in other arthropod lineages, scorpions, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, and yet we don't see that in insects. In fact, I'm only aware of one family of insects, the Dryaenidae in Diptera, that have evolved claws. And despite all the research that I've done, I haven't found any studies that have looked at why insects don't evolve claws, whereas all the other arthropods do. So what I'm about to say, take with a grain of salt. One advantage that insects might have in evolving raptorial limbs over claws is that the femur and the tibia are already pretty elongated, and the leg segments are reduced. If you look at arthropods outside of insects, they have a lot more segments to their legs. This might complicate raptorial limbs evolving, where the legs that are going to become raptorial limbs would have to reduce the number of segments and then become raptorial, which is probably why you don't see raptorial limbs that often outside of insects. With the tibia and femur and the other leg segments all where they're supposed to be, it would be easier just to modify that rather than the tarsal segments. Insects also have very small tarsal segments compared to other arthropods. Again, this simplification of the leg. However, we do know of an advantage that raptorial limbs have over claws, and that is the ability to use energy in an efficient way to create a fast snapping motion. One of the insects that have been studied the most for this is the mantisfly. So we're going to use the mantisfly as a model for other raptorial limbs. Obviously there's going to be some differences across the different orders of insects, but this can be used for a baseline and a general guideline to understand how a raptorial limb works. To load the spring, the mantisfly opens the raptorial limbs by contracting a muscle called the M25. Attached to the inside of the tibia are internal structures that push up and down on a tendon at the same time. Tendons act similarly to rubber bands. They store a lot of energy and release it suddenly for a burst of speed. One of the internal structures, called the ventrotibial complex, or VTC, has a groove down the middle. To prevent the tendon from sliding into that groove, two muscles, the M24C, on either end of the tendon pull in opposite directions. The tendon is already storing an incredible amount of energy, but the final complex, the M24A and B, pulls on the opposite end, stretching it even further. When ready to release, the two M24Cs relax, causing the tendon to slip through the groove into its relaxed state. The pulling of the M24AB, as well as the stored energy in the tendon, makes it snap faster and with less energy than it would if it were just being powered by muscle alone. Again, there's a lot of variation in this across the insect tree. For example, mantids start primarily with the legs closed, whereas the mantisfly starts with the leg open. But in all cases, the raptorial limbs are storing potential energy and then releasing that in a quick burst of speed in a very efficient way. All this is to say that the next time you're out and about and you happen to see one of these amazing insects sitting on your front door, maybe take some time and appreciate all the feats their feats are doing. Thank you for watching this video, and if you really liked what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you have any questions about insects, please leave them in the comments below.